So let me just tell you what we're going to do today. It's going to be a little bit different format, but I think it's going to be fun. We have a distinguished guest, Dr. Edward Brynn, who's a double doctor, 2 PhDs, and he is a retired United States diplomat and historian, a degree in a PhD in British history from Stanford and one in Irish history from Trinity College, Dublin. Dr. Brynn served as Chargé d'affaires ad interim in Mauritania, in the Gambia, in Burkina Faso, and in Ghana. And in Washington, D.C., he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and later Deputy Commandant of the National War College. So returning to Washington, 2009 to 2012, he was the State Department historian, overseeing publication of several volumes of the nation's official diplomatic history, foreign relations of the United States. So we're delighted that Charlotte Catton arranged to have him come here. We thank you very much. We've collaborated with Charlotte before, so thank you very much for doing that. And the format today is going to be, I should also mention he's a distinguished author of several books, including, where did I put it? Oh, I put it under here.
Nobody reads.
The Crown and the Castle, which looks very interesting. British rule in Ireland, very interesting. So the format today, Dr. Brynn says, is we're going to have more of an engagement of questions of substance, and he can respond rather than a formal talk. So I hope that will work well for you. But of course, we want to allow lots of people to engage with questions. So keep that in mind when you pose the questions. But we're delighted to have you here. Thank you very much for coming around.
My pleasure. This is a great group. It's never been applause before because you won't after this. I want to actually thank Charlotte as well. We have a pretty strong connection. Charlotte's brother, Jim, and Charlotte both grew up in Vermont, where I did, and I met Jim at Georgetown. We became very close friends, and a very close friend was my wife, Jane, who unfortunately died of brain cancer 5 years ago. But a very good friend of hers was at our wedding, and she met Jim, and the two of them got married. So that's sort of the connection. And so I am traveling, in fact, with Agnès, Jim's wife, and that's why we're here. So it's very good. I have some soft Canadian credentials. I grew up, as did Charlotte, in Vermont, which of course is a very small state just south of the Quebec border. And Montreal was sort of the nearest really big town. And my little town had a pretty strong Francophone connection. And so got to know Canada a bit through the Quebec optic, which was a lot of fun. I have a daughter, 5 kids. I have a daughter who is a senior official with the Bank of Montreal in Chicago for the American operation, so she likes it very, very much. Our kids were raised, for the most part, in Francophone Africa, so French is a language, or at least my version of French, which I would not test with, so there's a lot of francophonie in the family. In fact, my daughter Anne also did a degree in Paris, and so we. And my wife, in fact, was the head of the financial operations at an American embassy in Paris for several years, and I was never invited to serve in Europe, and that was okay with me. So I spent most of my time in Africa. I would like to say, first of all, that I'm a pro-Canadian, and I follow Canadian politics with probably a little bit more interest than most Americans do. I'm always astonished that Americans are so inward-looking, and I think they miss out on seeing what a really civilized country looks like. But anyway, that's just the way things are south of the border. I will just say a couple words about my own background, and then let's open up to the discussion. I'm half a diplomat and half, I suppose, an academician. I went undergraduate to Georgetown, then I did a PhD at Stanford and a PhD at at Trinity Dublin. I was in the military. I fought in Vietnam. I turned that war around. That's why I tell the kids we were winning when I got there. Joined the Foreign Service in '72, and spent most of my career in Sub-Saharan Africa. My last post overseas in the Foreign Service, I was ambassador in Ghana, but saw a lot of Francophone Africa for the most part. Other countries, Cameroon, Burkina Faso, Les Îles Comores, and other places. I really enjoyed it. I struggled to stay out of the European circuit and succeeded in doing so. I always tried to teach at the university wherever I was assigned overseas, and that usually meant dragging down the Francophone culture of various countries, because, of course, the teaching was in French. I traveled a lot on the ground in Sub-Saharan Africa. I never pretended to be a policy wonk. I was much more interested in running the embassies and seeing how Americans adapted themselves to that was a very, very challenging environment. I retired in 1999, and I became the head of international student operations for the University of North Carolina. And then after 5 years, I became a member of the faculty and taught. And then retired from that in 2010 and 2009, and that's when I was brought back to Washington, became the historian for the State Department. I have 55 historians working for me. On my watch, we published the 500th volume of the Foreign Relations of the United States series. It was begun in 1861. Abraham Lincoln signed the document. I was there. And we published about 10 volumes a year in that series. I was there for 3 years. The place had gotten into a bit of a mess, so they asked if I could come back. And said you have 3 months just to sort it out. Well, it took 3 years, but that was a lot of fun. And then since 2012, I've been teaching for 4 months each year at a German university. And I teach, believe it or not, Irish history, for the most part, in Ludwigsburg, which is a small university north of Stuttgart. So I'm there for 4 months and each year, and I will go again this year, and I look forward to that experience. I'll bare my soul. I think I'm a liberal in the American political tradition. I did work for Pat Leahy, who was the senator from Vermont, other than Bernie Sanders. In fact, Leahy and I grew up in Montpelier, and we went to the same little Catholic grade school and high school. And I, in fact, worked for Leahy in Washington for a couple of years in the early 1980s on loan from the State Department as his representative on the Senate Intelligence Committee, which I know is a non sequitur, but that was the time of Reagan coming into power, and William Casey. It was pretty scary, and I traveled a fair amount with Leahy during that time, and saw a bit of the Middle East that way, and found it pretty interesting. I will be absolutely candid with you, because I know I'm safe here, and now that I'm retired, there's not much they can do to me. And I'm just going to open it up to you and ask if there are any questions you would like to ask me about either my professional experience or my ability to drive my truck through snow, as was the case yesterday, or anything dealing with the African dimension, or in fact with my optic on Ireland, which I see we have a second in command here in case things get out of control. So. All right. Anyone?
Could I just ask, moderator,
Sure.
when you ask your question, maybe you could just briefly say your name.
Yeah.
You know, because I probably know most people, but I think our guests would like to know a name to speak to. Okay.
And I will, if that is not followed, I will in fact press that. And I'd really like to know where you're from too. Okay. If you're at liberty to disclose anything that's sensitive about whether you came from south of the border or anything like that. So, okay.
Okay, it's open.
It's always, you have to give $1 to the first person. Yes.
Oh, good. It's an American dollar.
I gotcha.
My name's Bronchitis. This is my husband, Dave.
Dave, hi.
We lived in Burkina Faso briefly in the early 1980s. We were
Wow.
with a development organization working on water and health issues. Burkina Faso at that time, Ouagadougou was fairly large, but really a large village, as I know you will know, but very peaceful. The country was very peaceful, and really most of the surrounding neighbors, other than Ghana to the south and so on, were as well. Now we have what's happening in Mali. We know that there are always difficulties in Nigeria and so on. It's very difficult to get a lot of information about Francophone West Africa here in North America. And I don't know what years you were there, but perhaps you could just give us a little bit of a survey. We were there just when Thomas Sankara was, there was the student protest in May of '83, was it?
Yes.
And then the name changed to Burkina Faso that summer. What's happened there since? Just kind of a tone of what's happening there.
I was there from 1990 to 1993. I arrived just after Blaise Compaoré led the coup d'etat, which ended up with the death of Sankara. I had met Sankara when he came to Mauritania on a visit when I was running the embassy there. I liked him very much. I found him he was a thin, wiry guy. I thought he was quite intelligent, and I was really disturbed. I was already on line to come to Burkina Faso when he was executed. And I'll start with a story, which I would really like you to keep inside this room because it's really not something that should probably go too far. When I left Burkina Faso at the end of my tour in 1993, in fact, I was called back a few months earlier to become the interim head of the Africa Bureau back in Washington, and stayed on for a couple of years. President Compaoré asked me to come over and have a drink. That's fine with me. I went over and we sat out on the lawn in the presidential palace. A little unnerving. He always kept two leopards, lions, caged right behind. So you had to be sort of politically correct, I suppose. And the waiter brought out a big vat of ice, and then brought out about a huge bottle of Dewar's whiskey, and 2 glasses, no hors d'oeuvres or nothing else, but just this is truly a drink, a drinking session. And we sat there for 4 hours, and so I was trying to remain as sober as possible. And then in the evening, Compaoré focused on Sankara, and he was in a sort of a confessional mode, saying he had a very intense relationship with Sankara, and I got the impression that maybe it spilled over into a very intense personal relationship, and that then they had a falling out, sort of a hate situation, and that's what ended up with the coup. And as you know, Compaoré stayed in power until just last year, and the tenor of politics under Compaoré was scheming, but not as brutal as it had been sometimes before. Compaoré emerged eventually as sort of a peacemaker in the region. I had an experience where I had to deliver some nasty remarks to none other than Charles Taylor, who was in Liberia, but he would come up to Ouagadougou every month for rest and recreation. If you're coming to Ouagadougou on rest and recreation, you'll know that where you're coming from was pretty difficult. And when I was there, in fact, the last time I saw him, I delivered the message, and then I said to to Mr. Taylor, do you have anything you would like me to report back to Washington? And each time we'd have that meeting, he would say, "No, Ambassador, I resent the uncivil tone of your message, but that's it." So the last time I did that, and he said no, so I turned around and I got to the door, and I put my hand on the doorknob, and he said, "Ambassador Brynn." And I thought, it's better to be shot from the front side than from the back. So anyway, so I turned around, and of course he had this big muscular guy standing around him. He said, "Ambassador Brynn, I do have something I want to say. I resent the tone that the Assistant Secretary in Washington uses in those messages that you're delivering to me. I want you to tell Mr. Cohen," who's this guy, "I want you to tell him," then he stopped and he said, "Oh, forget it, Ambassador Brynn. If you had any influence in Washington, you would not be ambassador to a shitty little country like Burkina Faso." I put that in the cable, and I think that's the only cable of mine that was ever read. But everyone did that. But in the optic of Burkina Faso, I think we have an incredibly hardworking people, as you probably realize. I mean, these are people who really the salt of the earth, living in an extraordinarily challenging environment. I think and I think it's probably due to you, I think they had made some extraordinary improvements in water management and using very scarce water to try to get their agricultural system a little bit farther ahead. I came away from Burkina Faso with a more upbeat feeling about how Africans themselves, without a lot of fluffy aid money from outside, were meeting some of the challenges there. Maybe you agree with that. I like to camp, and I went everywhere in Burkina Faso over those 3 years. There's no need to stay in Ouagadougou. And really got to know a lot of the people, a lot of the Peace Corps volunteers, a lot of the people who were affiliated with organizations like yours that were, I think, doing good work. I thought that Burkina Faso was the only one of the 8 posts in Africa where I served where I thought the development theme was right, the tempo was right. And I have spent a lot of time in other places. I led the inspection team from the State Department to do Nigeria just last year, 2 years ago, I guess now. And I just feel that the disconnect is terribly high. So my admiration for the Burkinabe is high. Blaise Compaoré could have been more evil than he was. But I think that at the end of the day, this was a country where, despite the government, people were doing, in the context of how difficult it was, they were doing a pretty good job.
I understand there was an attempted coup last fall.
Just.
And if I have my facts correct, the people just said, no, we
No.
want that coup, get out.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, it was the 2 guys that were contesting it, both of them were people that I had met and had for meals at the house from time to time. So I got to know them well, and I think at the end of the day that worked out not too bad. Okay, thanks.
Other questions? I saw Trevor first and then Bob. Was that okay, Trevor?
Trevor.
Ambassador Brynn, I'm Trevor Page, and I'm retired in the community here. Most of my working life has been with the UN, both the Department of Political Affairs, but most of the time with the World Food Programme and High Commission for Refugees. My question also deals with Sub-Saharan Africa and the migration that we see to Europe, which in the headlines is obviously at this time from Syria, Afghanistan, and West Asia. But much more serious than that, in my opinion, is the migration to Western Europe from Sub-Saharan Africa. Although Eritrea is the country which is providing most of the migrants, even Ghana, in fact, has the highest number. from last year from West Africa. I've served in the whole of West Africa from the 60s through to the mid-90s. Whereas the war in Syria is so complex, it is stoppable.
Yeah.
In my opinion, the migration from Sub-Saharan Africa is something which is going to continue. And I wonder what your take is on that and whether you think it is serious. I think we have permanent migration of populations now. But it's Sub-Saharan Africa that I look to.
Yeah, I think, Trevor, I think you're right. The long-term agenda probably will see population transfers from Sub-Saharan Africa in a more sustained way. And I would make 2 points about that. One, the people that, for the most part, we're taking out of West Africa who end up here are like this gentleman here. You get the best. You get very talented people coming, and it's in a sense, it's a reverse foreign aid flow. We're getting people from both Francophone and Anglophone West Africa who are pretty much at the top of both in terms of their access to education, their moral and physical strength. I know from people that, because I know a lot of Germans now, they admire the capacity for hard work that a lot of the people who get into Western Europe bring, and it leaves big gaps in West Africa. I served in Mali for a couple of years too, and you could see that the very best people were often getting out, and it would leave big gaps in the both the private and the public sector. This whole phenomenon of the migration, of course, has very strong post-imperial aspects to it. The French philosophy was to make Frenchmen out of the colonial populations, and in some respects they did that rather spectacularly well. And of course, these people saw Paris as heaven for them, and really did not really want to go back. Probably less intense in the former British colonies, but at the end of the day, with the Western Europeans' birth rates being so absolutely dead in the water, I think there's going to have to be an accommodation to the fact that with proper vetting and organization and identification of the type of people that the Western European countries need, the inevitable place that they're going to come from is probably the African circuit, not the Middle East and nowhere else. But neither one of us, well, at least I probably won't be around to see, 20 years from now what this is going to look like. But it's there, and this Syrian thing is unfortunate in so many respects. Anyway, but it really does obscure, deflect attention from what's going to be the long-term migration trend. Yeah.
But okay, from the Western European need for more people and taking the brains of Africa, that's one thing. But most of the migrants are people who are hopeless, they can't get jobs, the economic situation in Sub-Saharan, obviously is different in every country, but is the main reason for migration.
Well, and that, of course, should be an incentive for the European countries in the European Union and otherwise to be more proactive in their assistance. But I think it really has to be more in the agricultural sense rather than trying to make a commercial and industrial sub-base in Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't think they can compete that way. Yeah. Thanks.
Boko. Keep a list here. Boko.
Okay. Boko from Benin. Close to
Where in Benin?
Benin, close to West Africa.
Yeah, but where in the
close
country?
to Cotonou.
Oh, close to Cotonou. Okay, good.
Yes, in capital.
Yeah.
Yeah, Burkina Faso has elected a new president after about 3 decades of one-man rule.
Yeah.
Yes, and followed by a civil uprising.
Yes.
2 years later. Okay, my question is following the first question. Can you give us quickly comments about the future of Burkina Faso? For example, do you think that one day Compaoré will have the opportunity to be questioned by a judge, for example?
I would say 2 things. One, on the positive side, we're finally seeing birth rates in Burkina Faso and a number of other falling very substantially. They have to. And that's because of increases in programs dealing with the regulation of fertility. This is offset a bit by the reduction in mortality for children, which of course is good. But on the whole, I think that there is in Burkina Faso and probably in some of the other countries in the region a rising awareness that health, sanitation, diet, and education are beginning to get much greater attention than was the case before. I think, secondly, there is a real challenge in Burkina Faso because the population is incredibly large for a country with such small resources, and it goes back to the water management issue. There's got to be, and there has already been, a fair amount of progress in water management, but it's still spectacularly well behind. Burkina Faso, ranks as about the poorest country per capita in the world, and yet you get the impression when you go to villages in Burkina Faso that things are working relatively well at the level that they do because of the investment of the people in very, very hard work. I don't think we have any particular solutions for that. We're not going to be taking very many people from Burkina Faso certainly into the United States. The Canadians have been more generous in a per capita basis on that. I think you're really going to have to see a very sharp continuing decline in birth rates to bring the population thing under control.
But Compaoré, do you think that one day we can...
Oh, he'll come back?
Yeah.
No.
We can... Yes, we can be questioned by a judge.
I doubt it. Yeah. I think if he had not gotten into the car and headed for Ghana, there would have been pressure to bring him back. But I think for the most part, the Burkina Faso would just say, he's gone. Yeah.
Okay. Knut, are you next?
My name is Knut Peterson. I'm with the Southern Alberta Council of Public Affairs. I came from Denmark originally 40-some years ago.
Okay.
So I ended up staying in Canada because I liked what I saw.
Good.
Anyway, my question relates to the sort of recolonization by corporate entities looking for resources in Africa and many other places in the world that basically does not develop the country other than once they get the resources,
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's a
big.
I like your thoughts about it.
First of all, of course, we always look at China, which is in a sense a state corporation that has come into Sub-Saharan Africa with a very strong emphasis upon the exploitation of natural mineral and other resources, and that is part of the downside from the slipping away of interest in Europe of the former colonies. If you go into France or today, the young people don't think of spending time as young people in teaching in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's sort of has floated away. The Chinese have come in and have, in a sense, filled in a vacuum. The Americans fall into the same category as France. I think we just have so much less interest in Sub-Saharan Africa than we did, let's say, 25 or 30 years ago. To be absolutely candid, when I was running the Africa Bureau, and I would get together with members of the Black Caucus in Washington, thinking that they, at least as a legislative presence, would push for keeping Sub-Saharan Africa higher up on the list. They were not much interested at all. Just were not. I have a politically incorrect thing to add here. Once the colonial powers made the decision to enter Africa at the end of the 19th century, they did so at the cost of destroying institutions of social control in most of Sub-Saharan Africa. Once that was done, then 50 years later, the pressure for leaving became more intense. Their own exhaustion at home after the Second World War added to it. And I'm afraid that the British and the French, and of course the Belgians and the Portuguese, left Sub-Saharan Africa at a stage where the indigenous institutions of social control had been terribly weakened, but the new institutions of social control brought in by the colonial powers had not yet really been implanted. So you ended up with the worst of all possible worlds. If you read books like Alan Ward's My Africa, which is a very slim volume but done in Ghana in the 1920s, you get the sense that it was going to end up very bad. The institutions that the Europeans were bringing in were not going to take hold, or at least not going to take hold in an effective way. But the powers of the chiefs and the respect of the old institutions, pre-colonial institutions, had been substantially weakened. And I think, frankly, that's what happened. Between 1960 and let's say 1990, just use some arbitrary figures, per capita incomes in most Sub-Saharan African states fell. Civil violence increased. The incapacity of the central government to exercise control diminished. And I think you're only seeing now, which and it's hopeful, but it's at the end of a very costly agenda. You're beginning to see some of the Sub-Saharan African states beginning to put themselves together. And what do they do? And what's the challenge? The challenge may be China on one hand, but it's international corporations, and a lot of them are American corporations that are deeply involved in exploitation of natural resources. And these corporations really play the field pretty aggressively. And at the end of the day, these Sub-Saharan African countries can't match them. So I'm rather pessimistic on that score. I find my own colleagues who are still serving in Africa, or people who work for me who are now ambassadors in Africa. It's a very frustrating time. First of all, security. We've gone overboard about security concerns, and so our people are working in fortresses in these various African countries, and so their effectiveness has been significantly diminished. And with the exhaustion in the United States about just about everything, nobody gives a damn about it. And so I think that we will see where there will be hope in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's going to be almost entirely in the people themselves. It's not going to be from outside.
Abdi.
My name is Abdi Kazimipur. I'm not from south of the border. I'm from east of the way east.
Way
from the Middle East. My question is, sort of, if I remember correctly, is about something that is suggested in the literature on the American foreign policy that I've read a long time ago, so I'm not sure if quoting it correctly, accurately. that Africa has lost its attraction for the American foreign policy?
Yes, that's sort of what I would say, yeah.
So I was wondering if you can comment, elaborate a little more on what was the source of attraction before and why the change and what would be the implications of that for Americans for that?
I would say that up to about 1960, much of the focus on Africa by Americans was African Americans finally getting some traction in the American political system as schools were integrated and some of the barriers to black African Americans being able to enter the political process. And they, like everybody else, searching for roots, like the Irish Americans going back to Dublin, they saw in certain places in Sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana is one of them, they saw a way to sort of regain their political soul. It's perfectly legitimate. So you had a height, you had a period when lots of Americans, with a core base of African Americans, and also a lot of non-African Americans, found it romantic and meaningful to search for ties and roots in Africa. That gradually dissipated, partly, I think, because they realized that African Americans are Americans more than they are, than they are Africans, and so their value system had transformed itself into being something much more like other Americans, granted with some differences, and that their ability to bridge the gap and become quote Africans again, it just didn't exist. I mean, there were some exceptions, but for the most part, the African American hype on Sub-Saharan Africa didn't sustain itself. Secondly, I think there was a strong feeling that on Capitol Hill that our economic assistance programs were not effective, and there is a widespread misimpression that we spend 10% of our GNP on foreign assistance in overseas, and of course it's less than 1%, 0.4%. But the feeling in Washington, we've got poverty at home, and let's worry about that. That became a second issue. And I think third, the reduction in economic ties. Probably we are no longer really dependent on Nigerian oil the way we used to be. There was a time when the Congo Basin provided the bauxite and the exotic metals that we needed to build airplanes and stuff like that. That's pretty much gone. And fourth, I think, is fear. There is an uninformed feeling in the United States that every American who goes into Sub-Saharan Africa is likely to be shot, captured, robbed, and done away with. And therefore, the American psyche, which finds it difficult enough for the rest of the world, really finds the alienation from Sub-Saharan Africa is really profound. It's gotten to the point, we really have trouble getting people in the American Foreign Service to want to serve in Sub-Saharan Africa. And when I was running the African Bureau, it was hard to staff the embassy sometimes. Everyone, the conviction was that everybody was going to have Ebola or malaria, or if you were assigned to Sub-Saharan Africa, that meant that you had failed in the Foreign Service, and this was a way to get you to the door. And this has become, I think, a crisis, a personnel crisis in the American State Department that. It may be severe in other parts of the world, in some other parts of the world, but in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's almost endemic. I was inspecting our embassy in Nigeria. I was in Abuja and in Lagos for long periods of time, well over a month, I just found the younger people suffering from very low morale, feeling that they were not listened to in Washington, and I think it's a problem which has reached almost acute proportions. So, yeah.
Andrew.
Andrew.
Thank you. As I mentioned before our meeting, I'm from the semi-autonomous country of Texas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we Vermonters would like to see you become more autonomous.
So my question, I ask you this not only as an American in Canada, but just out of interest in the challenges that you had to address. I can't help but imagine during the Bush era, maybe before, beyond, that American diplomats had a bit of a credibility problem with regards to American credibility. How did you, were there such problems? How did you address them?
There were such problems, and I didn't address them because I, in fact, retired from the Foreign Service in 1999, and Bush came in just right after that. His father was not a problem, but GW, of course, was really pretty bad, and it went down fairly far. I did take a group of Ghanaians, about 40 or 50 of them, who were involved in various economic enterprises, especially low-cost housing building. I took them to Texas, to the Houston. There's an annual fair, building fair, and the then governor, G.W. Bush, I sat beside him at lunch, and I said to myself, this is again politically incorrect, I said, this guy, I'm afraid, is going to get the nomination on the Republican Party for president, and if he does, it's going to be a disaster. But anyway, that was just my own personal thing. But I do know that those who worked under me and who then became ambassadors in Africa under G.W. Bush did find they had a real strong problem. And the State Department, let's put it bluntly, I think the State Department was deeply marginalized in the first decade of the 21st century, I guess. Up to 2008. And everyone thought when Obama was elected, then it's all going to turn around. Here we have, we have a president with an African heritage. Things will be really turned around. In fact, while there was some more proactivity and some more credibility for American diplomats in Sub-Saharan Africa, it was almost overwhelmed by indifference and neglect. It didn't return to. I was ambassador in Ghana when Bill Clinton came on a visit there, and he visited, in fact, 5 countries, and Ghana was the first one, and it went out spectacularly. The Ghanaians loved him. We had the largest outdoor audience that any American president had ever addressed. The second one was JFK at the Berlin Wall a little bit earlier. Clinton went to Georgetown. He was Georgetown 4 years behind him. I was commissioned to show Bill Clinton around campus at Georgetown when he came up as a student from Hope High School in Arkansas, and I was ready to do that, but he never showed. It's not the first time that Bill Clinton has failed to show, but anyway. But then when I became the assistant secretary, my job was to take newly arrived African diplomats, chiefs of mission, over to present their credentials to the president, and so we always did the briefing papers and stuff like that. And to my astonishment and awe, Clinton had really read this stuff thoroughly, and he was able to speak intelligently to every one of the diplomats that I took over. I mean, it was a big day for them. And after the first session with it took about an hour and a half, and he spent some time and was remarkably informed discussion on his part and their part, of course. I got them out into the cars, and I went back in, and I just said, Mr. President, this is a fabulous job. My ambassadors are really, really impressed. And he said, oh, do I know you? And I said, well, actually, you were supposed to know me. I'm supposed to show you around campus at Georgetown. You ended up coming to Georgetown, even though I didn't show you around campus. He said, oh, is that right? And I said, yeah. So then right after that, still on my watch, we had the great transition in South Africa, at the end of the apartheid regime, and the emergence of Nelson Mandela. And before the election, while Mandela was still a private citizen, he came to Washington as a private citizen, and it was my job to take him around and meet, for him to be introduced to, of course, everybody wanted to meet Nelson Mandela. So up on Capitol Hill and everything. Took him to the White House, and Mandela was there. It was quiet. It was not an official meeting, but Clinton turned to Mandela and said, so you know that Ambassador Brynn was instrumental in shaping my career. Poor Mandela. And he said, yeah, he's the one who persuaded me to go to Georgetown. And that's what got me interested in getting into politics. Well, it's pure crap. But of course, there are other people standing around. I instantly became a friend of Bill's. And then when he did come, when he came to Ghana when I was an ambassador there, we had for the first time in history, Bill Clinton finished a day's program a few minutes ahead of schedule. It was really difficult keeping him. And so we had a few minutes to ourselves, and I guess I was uncautious or incautious, and maybe we were both tired. I said, Mr. President, great day. It's gone very, very well. Could I ask you, what has been your biggest foreign policy mistake as president? So this was in 1997. Monica Lewinsky was all at that, but he was very focused. And he said, I failed to step up to the plate about what? What would you say? And Rwanda. Give the guy an A. Yeah. He said, I did not step up to the plate. And the Rwanda thing was on my watch when I was an acting secretary of the state, and it sure was. He said, yeah, that was the biggest foreign policy error of my time. And it goes back to, I guess, the early part of the question. Africa was just not getting traction in Washington. Rwanda, it's terrible, but it's not ours, and I'm not sure we've recovered from that. I know we haven't. Yeah.
Maybe we'll just give somebody else a chance here, and then we'll return to you in a minute. Is that okay?
Sure. I just actually wanted to add to what Abdi was asking.
Okay.
Before it's forgotten. Another reason I think for the shift away from Sub-Saharan Africa was the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Oh, of course. Oh, I forgot. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
We were, anybody who knew about the Canadian International Development Agency and those limited for $8 saw the shift away from Africa, Latin America, and so on, and to the...
I'm glad you brought that up. And I should add into that, it was my pleasure, and I think the best friends that I made who were diplomats of other countries were largely Canadians. I mean, I think that we, John Schramm, who was the High Commissioner in Ghana when I was ambassador there, and who was retired, lives on Amherst Island, south of Hamilton. I go there every summer, and this is the thing that often comes up. The bad news story about the collapse of the Soviet Union was that the competitive interest just went up in smoke. Yeah, thank you for raising that.
Thank you. Trevor.
Actually, that is a wonderful segue, because in fact I was going to mention Trevor Harrison, I'm in the Department of Sociology here. I do political sociology.
You're allowed to come in here?
Yeah, apparently. I have really wide interests about a lot of things, and I will say right off, though, I'm far from knowledgeable about Africa, but and a little bit more about my background. I do follow actually American politics a lot, though, and in fact,
I'll give you some more medicine. Yeah.
in 2010, actually, I had the great pleasure of a Fulbright being down at Kennesaw State University and followed the midterm elections. And before that, my going there, their main claim to fame, of course, was Newt Gingrich had actually taught there with his first.
That is correct.
His first appointment.
As a historian.
As a historian. So about Africa, and it falls actually on what Knut was saying as well, and certainly in terms of the Cold War, nationalism and the state structure in Africa, they don't coincide terribly well.
Yeah.
It goes back to colonial periods. But part of that strikes me is that many of the governments of the time there, as is elsewhere, were attempting really something we think of as nationalization, really trying to get hold of their own resources.
Yeah.
And Africa, much like Cuba, much like Iran, much like a lot of countries in the post-colonial period, got caught in the Cold War thing where to nationalize, to take under national control, these things became a symbol, it seems to me, in the West of the Soviets are moving in.
Yeah.
And there's a misconception here that nationalists were necessarily communists.
That's correct.
And so I'm just wondering how and I think we're still actually caught in that trap, because in fact, back to the question about commercial enterprise, corporations moving in all over the place, including state corporations like China. How is it that a sovereign people actually gets control over their resources to make development actually happen in a place like that?
Well, a couple of countries have been successful in this engagement. What you have to do, whether you have a commitment to a fairly quote socialized economy or not, you've got to make it credible that foreign investment will not be subject to arbitrary confiscation. And a couple of countries, Ghana is a good example, has actually established a business-friendly model where much of the state institutions remain in public hands, but private investment has been treated very fairly, and the Americans are fairly comfortable and Canadians as well investment. So that's the first thing. You have probably 8 to 10 states in Sub-Saharan Africa that have built a business model that makes private foreign investment comfortable in coming, and that's 7 or 8 more than was the case 25 years ago. So that's good. The second thing is for corporations to get an engagement level with people in those countries, so that the Americans feel comfortable going and staying there, and their incentive is to put people of that country in charge of the operations for the American corporation in that country. And again, that's working well in maybe about 8 to 10 countries. And if you can get those two things done, the personal relationships inside the corporation, and the sense of confidence that the investment will be treated as a business proposition and not subject to political concerns, you can do well. I'm rather optimistic on that score. I think we're beginning to see more countries move to that type of a model, but it's going to be a generation before it takes a long time. Yeah.
Any other questions on other topics?
Yeah,
We have a historian here.
Mr. Obama, what kind of legacy is he going to have?
I will say, I think he's going to go down as a very fine president. I think when the dust settles, 10 years from now, he's going to be like a Harry Truman was. I think he's going to be looked at pretty well. He's a cerebral guy, and of course he gets pounded all over the place for not being, quote, proactive in Syria, whereas of course we had a disastrous war there in the Iraq period. I think getting a fundamental start on this affordable healthcare system is going to be an incredible achievement for him down the road, and I think it will survive. But it's going to take some time. I think he has done more, I think, to move the country to acceptance of the same-sex marriage type of thing. I mean, the younger people are there. The older generation, of course, is still very much opposed. But I think Obama's going to look pretty good down the road. It'll be 10 years before you begin to get a verdict. But that was sort of the case for Truman. He was reviled when he left in 1952, but by about early 1960s, he began to look pretty good. Yeah, if Trump is in, yeah, I don't know. Yes, sure.
Totally different topic, but can the Republican Party, after the disaster it's going to face in the next year, can it rebuild itself from within, or will some other credible party opposing the Democrats actually arise?
I think option B. I think the Republican Party has become so internally traumatized between the old guard and the old center guard and the very extreme. I think you may see a new party.
I concur.
Emerging.
What would that look like? What would that look like?
Well, I think it may be a party that would actually represent effectively the white middle class to begin with. I mean, rather than a party that was really controlled by gobs of money in the top 5%, top 1%, and controlled ideologically by people in the extreme Christian tradition. So you may get a Republican Party that actually does represent a moderately conservative, business-oriented clientele who are interested in making money, but are not going to be enthralled by the ideological concerns around the side. That's fine. Yeah.
That's optimistic.
Yeah, maybe an optimist. Yeah, that's the genius of being very old. See, I can make these predictions knowing that I won't get emails. You were wrong, Brynn.
Other questions? No questions about Irish studies, English studies.
That's probably very good. Because I'd have.
Brian?
You were just saying earlier that you had been in Ireland during the same-sex marriage referendum.
Yeah.
Which could you comment on the changes that you think have taken place in Ireland? I know you were a student there earlier, over several decades, from almost medieval subservience to the Catholic Church.
I can be pretty personal on this. My wife and I were married on April Fool's Day, 1967, and we after just a honeymoon for a couple of weeks in Portugal, we spent the next couple of years in Ireland, newly married. We had our first child during that time. The church, I was raised Catholic, as was my wife. My wife was so completely alienated by what she saw in the old Catholic Church. She never was in church again after that. I was a little bit wobblier, but we knew from subterranean sources all about the Magdalens and the exploitation of these young girls. We knew that there was a widespread problem with priests and young boys, but none of this surfaced, even in newspapers that proclaimed themselves as relatively independent. It was just a national sort of a national curse. On the other hand, by the time we left in 1970, we began to see from 1968 and 69, we began to see some changes that were going to make a difference. First of all, you began to see the introduction, and this may sound frivolous, but you began to see the introduction in Dublin of restaurants that served things like salads. I mean, you got away from the old basic fare. You began to see a lot more Europeans coming into Dublin. The entry into the common market for Ireland was absolutely transformative. It really was a remarkable change, and we began to see a sharp diminution in the number of men and women who were going into the nunneries and the priesthood. And you know, today, I think last year, all of Ireland produced only 4 priests.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So most of the churches that you're going to now in Dublin, Catholic churches, so frequently you run across a priest from Ghana.
Sure.
They really come in large measure. Then of course the infusion, being in the common market, the role of the development of the pharmaceuticals headquarters in Dublin, the extraordinary rise in per capita income, and of course it's taken a bit of a blow, but it's still, I was in Dublin last year, it's a hell of a lot better, it's in pretty good shape. And so the younger people coming in made an entire difference. It's a remarkable change. And I think the Irish did get their economy back in order instead of going into a Greek-like woe is me status. And interestingly, you talk to the priests in Dublin, those that still exist, and it's interesting to read that more than half of the Catholic priests who voted in same-sex referendum last May voted in favor of the same-sex thing. I mean, even Rome must have had a heart attack about that one. But it's transformative, and now Ireland is an entirely different country. And just to add a couple of things, I think the visit by the Queen a couple of years ago to Ireland and how sensitively it was handled meant that some of the deeper wounds from the Irish Anglo-Irish connection have eased a great deal. I'm incredibly optimistic about Ireland. I really enjoy going every year. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that you have observed Canadian politics slightly,
yeah,
more with an interest than most Americans. Could you give us a little overview of the last 10 years in Canadian politics?
Well, I guess I share probably the celebratory mode of many of you in this room that the most recent election was good, and I must say the Canadians are so polite that even when I would stay every year in Amherst Island with my Canadian friends who worked in the diplomatic service, there was a hesitation to be really harsh about Harper and the crew. But I'll tell you, the day after the election, the emails I got, 10 years of, or whatever, a decade of pent-up feeling, now we're civilized again, or now we're Canadians again. It was really quite remarkable. But even in the bad days, there are some things you can just count on the Canadians to do so much better than you find, for the most part, south of the border. There was even in a relatively rough period, there was a level of civility in the political process north of the border that meant at the end of the day, I felt fairly confident that the tide would move in the other direction. I was as astonished as I think most Canadians were that Justin came on so strong in a very short period of time towards the end, isn't it? I mean, I'm not even sure Canadian pundits, for the most part, as far as from my reading, really anticipated that it was going to be this sharp a turn, and that it would be Trudeau carrying the flag. It was really quite remarkable. the change in Canadian politics here is a source of considerable consolation for the liberals in the United States who feel that they're just being terribly hammered all over the place by not regular Republicans, but by these Trump-like people. And it's going to be an extraordinary year. My daughter Anne, the one who's works for the Bank of Montreal in Chicago, she's a lawyer, and she said, if Trump gets in, I'm moving to Halifax. And I said, why Halifax? She said, well, I've already had discussions with him, so there must be a firm up there that she said, I'm just gonna opt out. And, go up. It won't happen, I suppose, but it's good that at least some Americans appreciate what a fantastic country you have. I came back on a Canadian airplane from Britain, I guess probably the last time I was coming back. I flew from Germany to Heathrow, and then I came back on a Canadian plane, and we came into Toronto. And I had to say, on that plane, coming into Toronto, were a lot of people of South Asian origin. The airplane was almost an encapsulation of the old empire. I mean, it brought people from all over different parts of the world living in a civil way with each other, and they behaved in a civil way on the airplane. They were people who had done well economically, had gone back home to see some people in Madras or whatnot. I felt that at the end of the day, the Canadian model of how to live internationally is just extremely impressive, and I really enjoy it. I was almost disappointed when the plane landed. Yeah, it could have gone on. So.
There are a couple of international seminars going on now. I know this because I've been invited to two, and Abdi went to one in Paris, where they're discussing in Europe how to have a diverse multicultural society. Yeah. And one of the agendas of one of them in London in the UK is just populated with Canadians. Like, how do we do it? And the reality is we haven't got a real good answer. Somehow we do it, but we're not sure how. So, but it's interesting to me that we're almost marketing something abroad now. Trevor.
I wonder if you'd say a little bit about your work as a State Department's historian.
Good.
Specifically, wonder whether you're just recording the official history, or whether you're in contact with your former colleagues and asking for the unofficial stuff, like you're telling us today. And my question is, I've just started doing that with retired UN World Food Program people because the official record is so dry.
Let me see. First of all, we have to work from publicly vetted sources. So I cannot say that we sit down with my colleagues who are and ply them with martinis in order to get other information out. But we have access to all the memos, confidential, back and forth, not just Hillary's. Everything that was done on tapes, and actually inside the box when policy is being formulated or hammered out or in Washington, there's an awful lot of very candid back and forth. I'll give you a story. I was sitting in the office early on some morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, and the phone rang. And by God, it was Henry Kissinger on the phone himself. And he said, "Pastor Brynn, I've just looked at the latest volume you've put out, and you say you have it in there that I called Antonin Brynn an asshole." And I said, "Yes." He said, I want that deleted. And I said, well, of course, the volumes have been printed, and 2,500 of them have already gone overseas. And secondly, we wouldn't take it out anyway because, one, you said it. He said, are you sure I said it? I said, we have it on tape. And we were amused how you mispronounced the word. And he said, yeah, but that was private. I said, no, you were saying that to your colleagues in a meeting where you were hammering out some aspect of foreign policy. Now, granted, this was 30 years earlier because it takes us that long to get the stuff declassified. And one of my jobs was to go to all the different presidential libraries and walk and talk them through to get the stuff done. Interestingly, to my astonishment, the library that was the most cooperative of the presidential libraries with me was the Ronald Reagan Library. They didn't even try to hold back anything. The most difficult one was
Richard Nixon.
Jimmy Carter.
Really?
Jimmy Carter, yeah, really very difficult to work with. Jimmy Carter came and stayed with me in Burkina Faso for a week. He came with his wife. Oh boy! And first thing she did was, Ambassador Brynn, this house needs to be redecorated. I said, yeah, it's Ouagadougou. It's fine. It works out just fine. And so then she went up to bed, I guess it was. And so Jimmy Carter said to me, "Thank God you said that to her." But I sat down with Carter at the time, and I said, this is before I became the historian, but it was a long time ago. I said, I hear from historians that it's a little bit difficult doing business at the Carter Center in Atlanta, that there's a real reluctance to share stuff. And he said, well, yes, but I figure I should have the last word. And then when I became the historian, and I was down there at the center, and I sat down with President Carter, and I said, I think I remember a conversation in Ouagadougou, and he, in fact, remembered every word of it. And he said, but I still believe that I have the right to hold stuff back. And we had a lot of trouble pressing him. We did have statutory authority to get the stuff, but sometimes very, very difficult. So it was Carter more than even the Nixon people. I think partly with the Nixon thing, with Nixon gone and all hell had broken loose, people, if you want it, take it. But so part of my job was, in fact, Trevor, was to get the information out. In that it was sort of my job to do that. But the second part of it was to make decisions as to what material was going to go in. We don't provide a commentary on it, except for a very, very short thing at the beginning about thanking people and all that for their help, or occasionally saying, we did not get cooperation in this area, and we had to withhold some information because it got blocked further on. We still have one volume from the 1950s where the U.S. Played the major role in the overthrow of the Iranian regime, and we still can't get that. We still can't get that out. But for the most part, 30 years is a healing time. Most people, after 30 years, say, "What the hell? Yeah, it's okay." So in that part, we can put the volumes together with just about all the stuff we want. Each volume, the volumes are big. They can be up to 1,500 pages each. I had a volume. One of my historians dropped on her foot and broke it in the office. So these are sometimes massive affairs. Are they of any use? Americans, of course, don't pick up a volume of foreign policy, foreign relations of the U.S. very often. But interesting, a lot of foreigners do, especially in countries where they can't get it their own. We look at the Canadians and interestingly, the German comparable efforts as probably being the best in the world. we sort of put ourselves in that category too. But the Canadians and the German archival productions are absolutely first class. So I would ask an embarrassing question: how many of you read the volumes on the foreign policy archival productions in Canada?
Every night.
Every night, yeah. But no, the Canadians do a very good job, and they do get their stuff out a little earlier than we do. Ours does tend to be. But a fascinating job. It really was. When I got there with a real crisis, they had been a political point. He was the head of the office, and he had done a pretty awful job. So, yeah, I had 33 historians on the job when I got there. Within 1 month, I fired 10 of them. And firing people from the civil service is not easy. But I fired them or got rid of them, and this is where I can say something very favorable to Hillary Clinton. She was Secretary of State, and so I had to report. I would sit down with her once a month for 15 minutes or so. But every time I came, I said I need more money to hire more historians, and she was absolutely fantastic. I was able to hire 30 historians in my 3 years, and they were almost all young people. But of course, historians can't find jobs, so I had the best. I hired more historians than any university, Harvard and Stanford included. So I was very, very popular. And we got absolutely great people, and now the production level is great. The office is running very well. I was even able to get them new quarters, which were really nice. And but at the end of 3 years, things were in very good shape, and I said, it's time for me to get a good successor, which I did, really a fine person, and to move on. But I look upon those 3 years as the best years of my foreign service life, and that was because I was able to really be a historian and also deal with the diplomatic thing in the best possible way. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question, maybe two, because we promised to wrap up at 1:30. So, Abdi, do you want to?
Just a quick one. Given your dual capacity as a historian and diplomat, what do you think about WikiLeaks and Snowden?
In principle, I think Snowden did a bad thing. I mean, I think that was a violation of confidentiality, and I would have to say, if he returned to the United States, I would be in the group that would say he should be held accountable. Having said that, I think that in the larger sense, the opening up of the highly concentrated, almost constipative process was probably a good thing. It led to very funny things. I got applause or envy from a couple of my colleagues because a few of my cables came up on this thing. And they said, "You're so lucky to have your cables up." And people who did see the cables that came out or began reading said, those people could write. I mean, they're really quite well written. And it was a boon to the State Department's foreign policy operations that at least we were literate. Okay. But and one of the cables actually had to do with Burkina Faso, but we'll leave that for another time. Any other?
This is a great question. Any last questions? Because we want to let Ambassador Brynn relax after talking all this time. But yes, please.
Is there an event in your diplomatic career that you'd like to have a movie of the week made of?
Yes, that's very easy. My week with Mandela. And it was so funny, but I took him up the elevator. The elevator goes to the 8th floor to meet with the then Secretary of State, Christopher Warren. Probably nobody even, we couldn't tell whether he was dead or alive. But anyway, as the elevator left the floor, I had all week, I had wonderful things with Mandela. But, as the elevator left the ground floor, suddenly it stopped between floors, and it was black. And I said, fuck. And then it started up again. And so afterwards, going down, I apologized. So I said, that was not very good. He said, well, it wasn't very diplomatic. That was Mandela telling me. But he said, yeah, it was understandable. He said, look, I spent 20 years in that type of a situation. And when you said that word, it just reminded me how miraculous the change has been for me. And it was things like that with Mandela all week, and I've loved to have that week. Yeah. Thank you.
That would be neat. Thank you. It's a very great privilege to have you there. I have you here. I'm glad you could come, and I think we all learned a lot, and we're grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Charlotte went out to rescue her car or something.
Yes, she did. I
Yeah,
think she's coming
she
back.
said she's giving you some time, so if you have a few minutes.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
good, great. Well, thank you all. As I say, I would love to move to West Brynn. I think it's a great town. It's a great country. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. I'm
Yeah,
very
thank you.
grateful to
On this day, it's great.
Come next week and hear John Usher, same time, 12 o'clock.
Saying the same things.
Yeah.